Hello, I'm Marianne Mashiri. A very warm welcome to BBC News Now. This will be 3 hours of very fast-moving news, interviews and reaction. And the story everyone's reacting to today is this. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson deliberately and repeatedly misled MPs about parties at 10 Downing Street when coronavirus lockdown measures were in place. That's the conclusion of a report by MPs, which says it would have recommended suspending him as an MP for 90 days if he hadn't already stood down from the role after he saw the report last week. Well, it also recommends the former PM should not get a pass which allows ex-MPs to access Parliament after they leave. Mr Johnson has admitted his statements about the parties misled Parliament, but denied doing so intentionally or recklessly, saying, "This is rubbish, this is a lie." Well, let's cross live now to my colleague Nancy Katringira, who is in Westminster for us, and with all the latest reaction. And the report really doesn't hold back, does it, Nancy?
No, it doesn't, Mariam. This is one of those situations where there were so many briefings about this report before it came out that a lot of journalists felt that they knew what was in it. But in reality, it's been much more severe than anyone thought it would be. As you mentioned, a 90-day suspension. Many people had thought it might be around 10. And also the recommendation that Mr Johnson's parliamentary pass be taken away from him. Severe, harsh punishments for Boris Johnson coming out of this report. Of course, this report still has to be approved by Parliament. We've heard from Penny Mordaunt, who is a leader of the Commons, that will happen on Monday. There will be a discussion on what to do about this report then. But right now, let's take a little bit of a deeper look into what exactly is in this report. Here's Jonathan Blake for us.
Well, the committee's report runs to more than 100 pages, 30,000 words or so. It is a lengthy investigation into Boris Johnson's claims that he made in the House of Commons and whether those statements were true, and if they weren't, as Boris Johnson himself has conceded subsequently, was he misleading the House deliberately? And in the language that the committee has been trying to establish, whether it was inadvertent, reckless or intentional. And we can have a look at the main findings of the inquiry, essentially, which has found that Boris Johnson did deliberately mislead the House of Commons, that he did commit a contempt of Parliament, effectively getting in the way of Parliament being able to do its job properly, and that in his conduct towards the investigation, particularly in the latter stages following his resignation as an MP, he committed further contempts in his language and approach to the inquiry. So let's focus on one of the main findings, which is that, in fact, Boris Johnson did mislead Parliament deliberately, and what the committee has used as evidence to establish that. And it goes through line by line here, its justification for coming to that conclusion. They say that Boris Johnson's repeated and continuing denials of the facts, for example, his refusal to accept there were insufficient efforts to enforce social distancing at gatherings, where a lack of social distancing is documented in official photographs, and that he neither saw nor heard anything to alert him to the breaches that occurred. Point by point they go through, also saying that the frequency with which he closed his mind to those facts and to what was obvious, so that eventually the only conclusion that could be drawn was that he was deliberately closing his mind. The fact also that he sought to rewrite the meaning of the rules and guidance to fit his own evidence, his own after the event rationalisations, the committee says. For example, the nature and extent of the assurances he received, the words used, the purposes of the assurances, who they came from, the warnings and so on. And they end by saying they came to the view that some of Mr Johnson's denials and explanations were so disingenuous that they were by their very nature deliberate attempts to mislead the committee and the House, while others demonstrated deliberation because of the frequency with which he closed his mind to the truth. So just a flavour there of the Privilege Committee's conclusions when it comes to misleading the House of Commons and whether it was done deliberately or inadvertently or recklessly. Very clear from that summary, just to give you a sense of why the committee believes that Boris Johnson was deliberately misleading MPs when he said that guidance had been followed in Downing Street at all times.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Jonathan Blake in the newsroom for us. So you can see there an exhaustive report, 30,000 pages of it, and he's been able to bring us some of the highlights from that. But now, those are the facts. What sort of meaning is being derived from those facts? Earlier, I spoke with Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General for England and Wales, and he gave me his analysis.
Evidence, frankly, against Mr. Johnson is overwhelming. It's overwhelming because of the evidence that parties took place, but what I think is particularly telling is that when he came to the House and made his various statements about giving assurances that there had been no parties, he had been specifically told by his officials that he couldn't give such assurances because it couldn't be said that the rules had been properly followed. But he just cheerfully decided to go ahead and do it. So whatever the circumstances which he says brought these gatherings about, where he says he thought they were part of work events, when he actually came to the Commons and explained what had been going on, he knew that there was a problem and he deliberately decided to conceal it. And it has to be understood that this whole business is not about what he did in Downing Street, it is whether he lied to the House of Commons.
That distinction being made by Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General. I spoke to him earlier. Let's hear also from Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner and what she had to say about this.
Well, I think the Privileges Committee is pretty damning. You know, it's serious. Boris Johnson is not only a lawbreaker but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself and continues to act like a, pound shot Trump in the way in which he tries to discredit anybody who criticises his actions when actually a decent public servant would have done the honourable thing, would have had a little bit of humility and would have apologised to the British public for what they put them through.
He says he hasn't done anything wrong, that it's a witch hunt, that they've set out to get him from the beginning. What do you make of that response?
I think it's a load of rubbish and he knows it, and that's why he didn't challenge his seat. That's why he's resigned, because he knows he wouldn't win that by-election, because he knows the public can see through this act, this clown act that he puts on, whereas it's pretty obvious that that report is very damning into what happened. And he's disgraced himself and he should apologise to the British people. And Rishi Sunak shouldn't have propped him up for as long as he has. And the British public shouldn't be paying for the lawbreaker and the liar for his legal defence when he hasn't got a defence because he's banged to rights on what he's done.
Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner there with her reaction. Let's distill all of this a little bit with Rob Watsonopolis, correspondent, who's joining me here on College Green. So let's take stock, because a few hours after this report has been released, we've been getting a lot of reaction.
We have indeed, and I think it's first, before we even do the taking stock bit, it's probably worth reminding ourselves, Nancy, that in 1,000 years history of this institution of Britain's Parliament, no minister, former Prime Minister or sitting Prime Minister has been on the receiving end of such a damning report. I mean, it really is a fairly extraordinary moment, just to sort of set it in its historical context. And in terms of reaction, well, reaction has been pretty much along the lines that you could have entirely predicted, and that is that sort of chunk of people inside the governing Conservative Party and the large minority in this country who like Boris Johnson and whose attitude to him could still be summed up as good old Boris. They think, stitch up, this is ridiculous, what on earth is it all about? Now, the other chunk of the population, a large chunk of the population, and some in the governing Conservative Party think this is how on earth did this man ever get into high office? Why on earth did the Conservative Party have him as leader? And how on earth is Britain going to recover from the sort of damage they would see that he has done to our institutions? So the reaction has gone pretty much entirely on those sort of bifurcated lines.
And if you think back to when you were covering Boris Johnson, when he just gotten into politics, there was a certain view that people had of him. I mean, when you reflect on what he was then and what it's come to now, I'd be interested to hear what you make of it.
It's an extraordinary change. And the question that we political correspondents, Conservative Party, gets asked is this the end of Boris Johnson? And I think the sense here is probably yes. And it's because of that change. And, you know, it's worth reminding ourselves, and, you know, maybe you have to be over 40 to remember this, but 25 years ago when Boris Johnson burst onto the scene, it was as this incredibly funny, witty presenter of a TV programme called Have I Got News for You? And so the first perception that British people had of him was as a celebrity, this incredibly funny guy. He was patriotic, and he sort of seemed above politics, right? I mean, most people didn't know whether he was Conservative or Labour. He was just the funny guy with the blonde hair. Of course, that was what enabled him to become mayor of the city. It's worth reminding ourselves he was mayor of London, a very liberal, normally Labour city. Then, of course, we get to the referendum, which was a deeply polarising event where he led on the Leave side. I don't think Britain would have left the European Union without him. And it brings us to where we are now, which is from that sort of politician who could reach the parts that other politicians couldn't, to this guy who is now kind of profoundly polarising. And I think that's probably why he's going to struggle to make any comeback, because despite that sort of large chunk of the population that still thinks good old Boris, he's sort of become that most difficult of things, which is an unpopular populist. I mean, the polling is now not complimentary about Boris Johnson, because a lot of those people that liked him 25 years ago think, you know what, he's not what I thought he was.
And looking at the findings of the committee, one of the things they found is that he was complicit in a campaign of abuse against the MPs investigating him. I mean, just for context, how unusual is a situation like this, where you have a former Prime Minister railing against a committee that's been set up, a cross-party committee that's been set up by Parliament, saying that they're on a witch hunt against him?
Well, I guess if you had a scale of usual where 0 was usual and 100 was immensely unusual, this would be up closer to the 100 mark. And again, it's what Mr. Johnson's critics would see as his sort of, is this a word? I don't even know, Trumpisation of British politics, that idea of you turn on your critics, you're the victim, it's a kind of a witch hunt, because essentially what this committee has been saying, that they had needed, that the MPs on this committee had felt they needed extra protection, right, security, in case they were attacked, presumably by members of the public who were very unhappy and had taken Boris Johnson's side, because he had labelled them as a kangaroo court. In other words, they're accusing, I mean, you have to sort of pinch yourself to get round this. I mean, essentially this committee had accusing the former Prime Minister of this country, of inciting violence, potentially.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Well, we're very glad to have you to talk us through it. Rob Watson there, our political correspondent. And just to remind you, some of the top lines that we are sharing today, that long-anticipated report by MPs into whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament over COVID lockdown parties did come out this morning at 9 a.m. and it's found that he deliberately misled Parliament. We'll bring you more on that as we get it. There's much more on our live page. Stay with BBC News. Thank you, Mariam. We're getting all the reaction that's coming in after this report was released by the Privileges Committee of Parliament that has found that Boris Johnson deliberately misled Parliament and has recommended heavy sanctions against him, which will, of course, be discussed by Parliament on Monday. But we've been getting reaction to the content of the report, and I'd like us to listen into a conversation I had with Conservative MP Michael Fabricant. He was given recently a knighthood by Boris Johnson in his resignation honours list, and he has mentioned that he feels the report by the cross-party committee was swayed by political decisions. Let's listen to what he had to say.
It's quite clear that he misled Parliament. I think what's not so clear, and I haven't read the evidence, is whether or not he knowingly misled Parliament. Now, that might sound like dancing on the head of a needle, but actually it's quite an important point, because normally the Privileges Committee would look at whether someone knowingly tried to mislead Parliament, and he maintained, of course, that he was getting legal advice that it was legal. But I'm not going to argue that now, because, as I said, I haven't read the evidence. What I am concerned about is that a number of people have criticised others who have impugned the nature of the Privileges Committee. And what I do want to say was that I was there when Boris Johnson gave evidence to the committee. Now, that committee stands in a quasi-judicial role, like a court of justice, and when Boris Johnson was answering questions, I could see members of the committee, not all of them, some of them behaved with great dignity, as jurors would do in a court, but some of them were pulling faces, looking skywards, turning their backs on Boris Johnson. And, you know, justice doesn't just have to be done, it has to be seen to be done.
So those are the views there of Conservative MP Michael Fabricant, who is a supporter of Boris Johnson. As you can hear, there is a range of views on this issue. But let's hear now from Penny Mordaunt, who is the leader of the House of Commons. This is because the report will be debated and voted on in Parliament on Monday. And Penny Mordaunt has spoken about this, saying that it will be a difficult day.
These are difficult matters for the House. We have to look at the evidence, we have to look at the report, but we are talking about people who are friends and colleagues. It will be a painful process and a sad process for all of us, the task that we face on Monday. But all of us must do what we think is right, and others must leave us alone to do so.
So that was Penny Mordaunt saying that this is going to be difficult for members of Parliament having to make these decisions about one of their colleagues. Earlier, I spoke to Boris Johnson's former boss when he worked for the Daily Telegraph newspaper, Sir Max Hastings, and this is what his reaction to the report today was.
This is a devastating report, much more explicit than some of us dared to hope. And it seems intended not merely to criticise Boris Johnson, but to bury him. And that's the result of his own conduct over many years. And of course, it was almost inevitable that he should attempt what we could call the Trump defence or the Berlusconi defence, where he simply seeks to present himself as a victim of all this. Now, some of us have argued, I called him in the Times the other day an undischarged moral bankrupt. And some of us have said over this Partygate business from the beginning that you can make a case which some of Johnson's supporters make, which is all this doesn't matter. What you can't credibly do is to do what Boris Johnson has sought to do, which is to say it never happened. I didn't break the rules. I didn't break the rules. This is obviously nonsense. And this is exactly what the committee has found, because how could it find anything else?
I was speaking there to Sir Max Hastings. He was Boris Johnson's boss when he worked at the Daily Telegraph. Let's bring in for some more reaction now Michael Cockrell, the journalist behind the documentary Boris Johnson, The Irresistible Rise. Michael, thank you very much for talking to us. This is a day, obviously, when a lot of attention is focused not just on the report, but the very essence of who Boris Johnson is as a politician. I wonder, if you think about what you have seen, really looking into his life and into his character, is this a moment you saw coming?
Well, I think if you looked again at the film which you mentioned, Boris, The Irresistible Rise, you would have seen it coming. There was a picture that was presented there of which has played out on the public stage for the last 6 years since the referendum result. I'll give you just a tiny example. Boris hates losing. I played tennis against Boris while making the film, and he was on the court like a gorilla. The ball would be up in the air and he'd go, "It's mine, mine." And he said afterwards, he said, "I'm very, very worried about this film, Michael, because you were up at the net and I kept trying to hit it at you and knock your head off, and you kept getting it back. And I'm really worried that when you put your film together, you may make it look as if you're a better tennis player than I." And that's the way he is. He's the most competitive of men. At the age of 5, he decided he wanted to be world king. And he toned that down a bit to just being British Prime Minister, and spent all his life until he became British Prime Minister doing that, seeking to be Prime Minister. And when he was at Eton, he was often in the sorry, I'm getting some talk back coming in my ears, but don't know where it's coming from. When he was at Eton, he was often in the school plays, and he never learned his lines. And the school plays would turn into a kind of farcical play between Boris and the prompter. And I said to him, "Have you made it a rule in your life that just as you never learnt your lines in the school play, that you realised that you could get more laughs by not knowing your lines than by knowing them?" He said, "Whoa, Christ! I mean, Michael, if what you're saying is, do I sometimes give the impression that I don't quite know sometimes what's going on? Well, sometimes I may give that impression, but sometimes I do know what's going on, but people don't know whether I do know or not." And that's some of Boris's logic in life.
Well, just to pick up on that, I think many people might recognise what you're describing there in the way that they have seen him behave as Prime Minister. But when you think about this moment in British politics, when a Prime Minister is receiving such a damning report from a Committee of Parliament, does the fault lie with Boris Johnson, or does this prompt you to reflect about the system that elevated him to the very highest office in the land?
Well, one of the things that prompted me to think about Boris Johnson in terms of his reaction to this, which he put out both before and after the report was delivered, where he called it complete rubbish, a lie, deranged, and that kind of thing. So he when he was at Eton, his schoolmaster said he regards it as churlish of us not to realise that he is a special person who doesn't have to obey the same laws and conventions of everyone else in the school, and that's churlish that we don't recognise his genius. Well, I think he feels it's churlish of the Standards Committee, the Privileges Committee, not to recognise that they had a great figure in front of them. He wrote a book about Winston Churchill, which seemed to be a book which showed how Winston Churchill had modelled his life on that of Boris Johnson. Winston Churchill had been a journalist, Boris was a journalist, and so on. He was born with the gift of tongues, and an amazing gift with words. And unfortunately, these words, as one of his former mistresses said, lying comes to Boris as naturally as breathing. The problem is he's not a very good liar. That was his mistress.
Rob, up some from you, Nancy.
Are you still there?
Yeah, you just got to do an up some. Cue Nancy.
Well, thank you very much, Michael Cockrell, the journalist behind the documentary Boris Johnson, The Irresistible Rise. We're halfway through the day already, and of course we're bringing you all the latest on that long-anticipated report by MPs into whether Boris Johnson deliberately misled Parliament this committee, the Privileges Committee of Parliament, found that he did. They've released a long report detailing why they have recommended some pretty severe sanctions over Boris Johnson, including taking away his parliamentary pass. We'll bring you all the latest here on BBC News. Stay with us.
And it's over to you, of course, as ever. Just a quick reminder, let's bring in Dave in Leicester, Peter in Leeds, Neil in Sutton Coldfield. Good morning, all of you. Hi. Just a reminder of the Privileges Committee findings this morning. It's your reaction. That's what we're looking for. This is the conclusion of the Privileges Committee. They had provisionally concluded that Mr. Johnson deliberately misled the Commons. It says that if Mr. Johnson was still a member, he should be suspended from the service of the House for 90 days for repeated contempts and for seeking to undermine the parliamentary process by deliberately misleading the House, deliberately misleading the committee, breaching confidence, impugning the committee, thereby undermining the democratic process of the House, being complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. Obviously included in that is his use of the words kangaroo and court juxtaposed with each other. It also recommends that he should not be entitled to a former member's pass. And in responses, Mr. Johnson has released a furious statement. This is a dreadful day for MPs and for democracy. This decision means that no MP is free from vendetta or expulsion on trumped-up charges by a tiny minority who want to see him or her gone from the Commons. I do not have the slightest contempt for Parliament or for the important work that should be done by the Privileges Committee. But for the Privileges Committee to use its prerogatives in this anti-democratic way to bring about what is intended to be the final knife thrust in a protracted political assassination, that is beneath contempt. It's for the people of this country to decide who sits in Parliament, not Harriet Harman. Neil, what do you make of it all?
Yeah, hi Nicky. Thanks to you and the team having me on. I just wanted to sort of say that when you go through a change process, which Boris and his supporters are going through at the moment, you tend to go through a sort of series of stages that you go through. So the first stage is disbelief. I can't believe that Boris wouldn't do that. And then you sort of move into anger, which is, I can't believe you can say that about Boris. And I think Boris is still stuck in that anger phase. And then you go into an arguing phase where you start to try and reason as to whether what the change is acceptable or not. So you start saying this is a witch hunt, and there's people who are out to try and get me, and then eventually you move on to acceptance. I think the problem is that Boris and his supporters are stuck in that arguing phase, and because there's a large group of them, they're all sort of sticking to the same argument, however ridiculous it might sound. I think they all just need to move on and accept that he's broken the rules. He's going to serve a long parliament, and that's probably his political career over.
You sad about that?
Not particularly. He was entertaining, but the guy shouldn't have been anywhere near leadership. He's a bit like Trump. He's a bit of a narcissist. He's out for himself. He wasn't really looking after the country. I think one of the best things I've ever heard about him was he looked at which way the crowd was running and then ran out in front of them saying, "Follow me." So I think it's good riddance to him.
Peter in Leeds. Hi, Peter.
Yeah, I agree entirely with the last speaker. I think everything he said was perfect, and he's probably going to put it better than I will. This is an indictment on the Tory party. And by the Tory party, I do not mean the Conservatives. There was a party that had Macmillan, that had Major, that had Heseltine, that had Clark. That party believed in the needs of the people. It knew they needed to have health. It knew they needed to have education. It knew they needed to have housing. And it tried to help the people. And in doing that, it maintained values that we've had for years, for generations, for centuries. That people learned from their parents, that their parents learned from their grandparents, and their grandparents learned from their great-grandparents. And then we voted in, with Cameron, the Tories. And the Tories are interested in the rich. That's all they're interested in. And if they're rich, you don't care about the health service. You don't care about the schools. You don't care about public services because you don't need them. You live in your own little bubble. And like Boris, you can have your own little parties while the rest of the country is being broken on the wheel of the party. That's the Tory party. The Tory party that believes that you can control the press with money. They do. The Tory party, which is controlled by rich people who make sure that the Tory party, not the Conservatives, the Tory party acts on their behalf.
You make a good point, actually, about strong stuff. You make a good point there about Conservatives. It would be great to hear from party members. Many party members are part of the Five Live family. Peter, hang on.
Check whether they're Tories or Conservatives, because there's a difference.
Okay, right. A bit of a deep political analysis. I understand what you're saying. Wait a minute. Dave in Leicester.
Okay,
hello, Dave.
Hi, good morning.
Lots of voices. Dave, carry on.
Yeah. I contacted the show primarily just to talk about the rules and regulations and the guidelines, because I retired in November 2020 during the second lockdown. I worked in a police facility, so they followed the rules very assiduously in terms of, sticking to the guidelines and the rules. But I had a gathering in the office. There's a gathering in the office. There's a presentation. We follow the rules and the guidance to the letter. It's impossible. So we followed the spirit of it, and I think we're all human beings, and to work and spend a lot of time together and then not interact and not have that emotional sort of situation. It's inhuman.
All right, imagine, Dave, you've just taken an oath, right? And I say to you, just answer these questions. Did you have a gathering in the office?
Yes.
Did you follow the rules?
As best we could.
What does that mean?
Well, that means if the rules,
yes or no? Did you follow the rules that you made?
Well, we followed the rules and the guidelines as much as it was possible to do. Once you walk around with a 2-meter stick, and place that down every time you stand near somebody, then you do not. It's impossible to. In my view, it was impossible to follow those rules and guidance to the letter, but we did our best. I'm not here. I mean, I've supported Boris Johnson. I voted for him. I was a Conservative member when he.
But I'm coming to the point. Dave, I'm coming to the point with huge respect, and I'm listening to you, and this is about giving people a say, but it's not about the parties so much as misleading the House, misleading the committee.
No, and I'm not. I didn't make any reference to that in my text. I'm not here to defend what Boris Johnson said to the House.
Got you.
I'm just trying to present what started this in the first place was the investigation into the gatherings and parties, etc. in Downing. So what I'm trying to say is that I was in a police facility during lockdown. All the rules and the management were very keen on everything being followed but all I'm trying to say is that what starts all this off in the first place was just something that was very, very difficult to do.
Especially people will say in the Warren-like atmosphere, the Warren-like environment of the House of Commons. I mean, he says in his letter, let me just read this, in your defence, we didn't believe that what we were doing was wrong, and after a year of work, the Privileges Committee has found not a shred of evidence that we did Their argument can be boiled down to, look at this picture. That's Boris Johnson with a glass in his hand. He must have known the event was illegal, therefore he lied. This is a load of complete tripe. That picture was me in my place of work trying to encourage and thank my officials in a way that I believed was crucial for the government and for the country as a whole, and in a way which I believe to be wholly within the rules. All right, let's bring in, I appreciate that, Dave. Let's bring in somebody we haven't yet heard from who is going to be there in just a second. Who is it? Let me just, I'll tell you what, I'm moving around my running order so much. It is Matt in Branford Speak in Devon.
Hello, Nicky.
Hello. Give me some sunshine. Is it nice where you are today in beautiful Devon?
Gorgeous.
Heaven in Devon.
Barely a cloud in the sky.
Oh, lovely.
Pigs in the distance in a field.
Ah, beautiful.
Grass coming on.
A long way from Westminster.
A very long way.
Yeah.
We as small businesses, we struggled through the pandemic. We took on our bounce back loans and we towed the line. I didn't see my children for months. I didn't see my partner for months. And we're still paying for it. Every month it goes out. So, you know what I want to say? I just want to hand my bounce back loan to Boris and let him pay for it, to be honest.
That you didn't see your partner for months. Just take us back.
Well, you're in that first sort of phase. We're all in lockdown. I'm trying to muddle through my work. Luckily, I secured a contract for a job for somebody. So I was busy doing that, beavering away, going into my workshop every day. But I couldn't see my partner for months and months. So finally, we managed to see each other when we managed to sort of bubble up. But it took a long, long time. And the same with my children. I had to sit at the end of their garden once every sort of month or so after 2 or 3 months of not seeing them. So we towed the line emotionally, and we've also done it through money, and it's cost us loads of money. Our businesses have become fragile, and every month the money, like I say, it's still going out. So I'm angry, to be honest.
Are you angry with the rules, or are you angry with the fact that he was dishonest in Parliament?
It's dishonesty. It's on a grand scale in front of a whole nation. When you're asking a whole nation to do something, and then it's obviously beneath you, or you turn a blind eye, whichever, I don't know. Or whether it's stupidity. Maybe it's that. But it's not what we were doing. And it's not what I was doing as an individual.
Sheila in Newcastle upon Tyne. Hello, Sheila.
Good morning, Nicky.
What's your reaction to this report?
Well, it's no less than I actually expected, having watched his performance before the committee and heard him speaking in the House of Commons. It's a very sad day, really, when the next Prime Minister is found guilty of, misleading Parliament, but also his response. That's very sad.
The long letter that I attempted to read with not huge success, but I think I got the main points across. Let me just run a couple of those lines by you, Sheila. This is a dreadful day for MPs and for democracy. The decision means that no MP is free from vendetta or expulsion on trumped-up charges by a tiny minority who want to see him gone from the Commons. For the Privileges Committee to use its prerogatives in this anti-democratic way to bring about what is intended to be the final knife thrust in a protracted political assassination, that is beneath contempt. It's for the people of this country to decide who sits in Parliament, not Harriet Harman. Protracted political assassination. Infamy, they've all got it in for me. There's a bit of that, isn't there? He believes...
Absolutely. The man's paranoid. This is the man who one of the most important points of Brexit, it was predicated on the sovereignty of the British Parliament. You know, the British Parliament is sovereign.
That's a good point.
This committee is a function of that Parliament. It is a function of the House of Commons. And it was asked to investigate this at the request of the House of Commons, in which the representatives of the people of the country, the people who voted, therefore, you know, by Boris's, logic, that is the House of Commons is the voice of the people. They requested the setting up of this privileges committee, which acted within the rules under which it was set up, and it has delivered its verdict. For him to then traduce that is, you know, basically demeaning the sovereignty of the British Parliament. It goes against what he supposedly stands for. But then that's not new, is it? I'm afraid Boris uses these institutions simply for his own purposes. And it's sad to see him traduce the British Parliament in this way. That's all I have to say on the matter. For a change.
Oh, do you think that is the last we will see of him in a political sphere?
No. Is it the last we've seen of Donald Trump? No. And I'm afraid Boris is simply in his mould. It's appalling to see how alike these two egregious characters actually are. They're narcissists, you know, and they create their own truths. I mean, maybe in Boris's own mind, he actually believes that what he says is true. But unfortunately for him, that doesn't actually make it true.
That's interesting. People who are economical with the truth, but believe they are telling the truth.
I think if you keep... Well, there is that tale, isn't there? If you keep repeating a lie...
We know people like that, don't we?
We all do. And it's very difficult to shake them from that belief.
That's your belief. Leroy in Watford.
It is
Hi.
indeed. Okay,
Thanks,
forgive me. I have to go, Nikki. Bye.
It was lovely hearing from you. Hello, Leroy.
Hi,
John
can you
Tom
hear me?
there as well. Yeah, we got you. And Kevin, your great Yarmouth as well. Hi, Leroy. All yours. Go on.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I've kind of come through was because I was both annoyed and amused by the tone in which you actually read out kind of Boris Johnson's statement initially. It was. I mean, the inference you put on it was like here was a madman having a complete, meltdown and a rant. And whilst that may be true, you don't know that as a fact, and therefore you were presenting the news, in my opinion, in a completely unbiased manner to say actually this is what I think that this guy was doing. Now, I'm not a Boris Johnson supporter. I think one, I was amazed he was ever voted as Prime Minister in the first place, and two, I was glad, the day that he left, and three, I'm very glad that this report has actually called him out to be what he is, which is a liar. But however, I do think that the media in general, and I'm calling you out individually on this one, have a right to present the news in an unbiased manner so the listener can make their own determination.
You thought it was a bit, when I read his letter, it was a bit hammy.
Somewhat, yeah. Yeah.
That's fair enough.
Because actually, when you read a bit of his extracts just now, back to the woman who's on before, it was much calmer. It got the same message across, but it was much calmer. It wasn't like,
You should be producing me. This is good stuff. This is wise, very wise. I guess I was taken with some of the language he used. I shouldn't be surprised because he's known for his florid prose, but he was making some pretty strong accusations there. Perhaps the craziest assertion of all is the committee's Mystic Meg claim, pointing his finger at Harriet Harman, talking about rank hypocrisy, talking about the fact that it's deranged, patently absurd. I mean, a strong language, kangaroo court as well. I take your point. Maybe I should have delivered it in a more measured way, but it is quite extraordinary, Leroy. It is extraordinary.
It is. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, look, at the end of the day, He wanted this to take place. It has taken place. You know, he's been found out to be the person that I think a large proportion of society believes he was anyway in the first place, unfit for the job and quite blatantly a liar, which you're not allowed to say. You know, so I'm glad we've kind of come to this final conclusion, and hopefully he'll move on into the sunset and find a very well-paid job presenting as a speaker somewhere in the evenings. But you know, I think it's just let's be fair. You know, if we're presenting the news, in my opinion, let's be fair.
Thank you very much indeed, Leroy. Suitably chastened, and why not? Great calls.
And this is one of those situations where there were so many briefings about this report before it came out that a lot of journalists felt that they knew what was in it. But in reality, it's been much more severe than anyone thought it would be. As you mentioned, a 90-day suspension. Many people had thought it might be around 10. And also the recommendation that Mr. Johnson's parliamentary pass be taken away from him. Severe, harsh punishments for Boris Johnson coming out of this report. Of course, this report still has to be approved by Parliament. We've heard from Penny Mordaunt, who is a leader of the Commons, that will happen on Monday. There will be a discussion on what to do about this report then. But right now, let's take a little bit of a deeper look into what exactly is in this report. Here's Jonathan Blake for us.
Well, the committee's report runs to more than 100 pages, 30,000 words or so. It is a lengthy investigation into Boris Johnson's claims that he made in the House of Commons and whether those statements were true, and if they weren't, as Boris Johnson himself has conceded subsequently, was he misleading the House deliberately? And in the language that the committee has been trying to establish, whether it was inadvertent, reckless or intentional. And we can have a look at the main findings of the inquiry, essentially, which has found that Boris Johnson did deliberately mislead the House of Commons, that he did commit a contempt of Parliament, effectively getting in the way of Parliament being able to do its job properly, and that in his conduct towards the investigation, particularly in the latter stages following his resignation as an MP, he committed further contempts in his language and approach to the inquiry. So let's focus on one of the main findings, which is that, in fact, Boris Johnson did mislead Parliament deliberately, and what the committee has used as evidence to establish that. And it goes through line by line here, its justification for coming to that conclusion. They say that Boris Johnson's repeated and continuing denials of the facts, for example, his refusal to accept there were insufficient efforts to enforce social distancing at gatherings, where a lack of social distancing is documented in official photographs, and that he neither saw nor heard anything to alert him to the breaches that occurred. Point by point, they go through, also saying that the frequency with which he closed his mind to those facts and to what was obvious, so that eventually the only conclusion that could be drawn was that he was deliberately closing his mind. The fact also that he sought to rewrite the meaning of the rules and guidance to fit his own evidence, his own after the event rationalisations, the committee says. For example, the nature and extent of the assurances he received, the words used, the purposes of the assurances, who they came from, the warnings and so on. And they end by saying they came to the view that some of Mr. Johnson's denials and explanations were so disingenuous that they were by their very nature deliberate attempts to mislead the committee and the House, while others demonstrated deliberation because of the frequency with which he closed his mind to the truth. So just a flavour there of the Privilege Committee's conclusions when it comes to misleading the House of Commons and whether it was done deliberately or inadvertently or recklessly. Very clear from that summary, just to give you a sense of why the committee believes that Boris Johnson was deliberately misleading MPs when he said that guidance had been followed in Downing Street at all times.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Jonathan Blake in the newsroom for us. So you can see there an exhaustive report, 30,000 pages of it, and he's been able to bring us some of the highlights from that. But now, those are the facts. What sort of meaning is being derived from those facts? Earlier, I spoke with Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General for England and Wales, and he gave me his analysis.
The evidence, frankly, against Mr. Johnson is overwhelming. It's overwhelming because of the evidence that parties took place. But what I think is particularly telling is that when he came to the House and made his various statements about giving assurances that there had been no parties, he had been specifically told by his officials that he couldn't give such assurances because it couldn't be said that the rules had been properly followed. But he just cheerfully decided to go ahead and do it. So whatever the circumstances which he says brought these gatherings about, where he says he thought they were part of work events, when he actually came to the Commons and explained what had been going on. He knew that there was a problem and he deliberately decided to conceal it. And it has to be understood that this whole business is not about what he did in Downing Street, it is whether he lied to the House of Commons.
That distinction being made by Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General. I spoke to him earlier. Let's hear also from Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner and what she had to say about this.
Well, I think the Privileges Committee is pretty damning. You know, it's serious. Boris Johnson is not only a lawbreaker but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself and continues to act like a, pound shot Trump in the way in which he tries to discredit anybody who criticises his actions when actually a decent public servant would have done the honourable thing, would have had a little bit of humility and would have apologised to the British public for what they put them through.
He says he hasn't done anything wrong, that it's a witch hunt, that they've set out to get him from the beginning. What do you make of that response?
I think it's a load of rubbish and he knows it, and that's why he didn't challenge his seat. That's why he's resigned, because he knows he wouldn't win that by-election, because he knows the public can see through this act, this clown act that he puts on, whereas it's pretty obvious that that report is very damning into what happened. And he's disgraced himself and he should apologise to the British people. And Rishi Sunak shouldn't have propped him up for as long as he has. And the British public shouldn't be paying for the lawbreaker and the liar for his legal defence when he hasn't got a defence because he's banged to rights on what he's done.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. Boris Johnson deliberately misled Parliament when he was Prime Minister about whether lockdown rules were broken in Number 10. That's the finding of the Parliamentary Committee made up of MPs from different parties. It has produced a lengthy and damning report which finds Mr Johnson misled the House, the committee and tried to undermine the democratic process. Well, the committee says that if Boris Johnson was still an MP, it would recommend he be suspended from Parliament for 90 days, much longer than had been expected. Mr Johnson stood down as an MP after receiving advance details of the report. which this morning he called deranged. Straight to Westminster this lunchtime, and our political correspondent Nick Eardley. It is a very long report and it is damning, Nick.
Isn't it just, Jane? Westminster had been expecting a really critical report. We knew it was critical enough for Boris Johnson to decide to stand down as an MP. But it's pretty clear now that he jumped before he was pushed. The committee says that even if Boris Johnson hadn't thrown his toys out the pram last week and criticised him in the way he did, that they would have suspended him for long enough to start the process that would have led to a by-election. But they're even more furious about the way he reacted to their initial findings, and that led to the suspension of 90 days that the committee would have introduced had Mr Johnson still been an MP. It all raises big questions about Mr Johnson's political future, as our political correspondent Helen Catt reports.
After almost a year of investigating, as Big Ben struck 9, there came an explosive verdict. The former Prime Minister deliberately misled Parliament when he made statements like this.
Mr Speaker, I'm sure that in whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times.
He'd committed a serious contempt, the committee said, and has racked up more since. Boris Johnson gave evidence to the committee in March. He was asked to explain why he'd told Parliament the guidance was followed when he'd been at events like this one in Downing Street, where there was clearly little social distancing. The committee said his explanations were so disingenuous that they were by their very nature deliberate attempts to mislead, that he had sought to rewrite the meaning of the rules and guidance to fit his own evidence, and that he had closed his mind to the truth.
Boris Johnson is not only a lawbreaker but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself and continues to act like a pound-shot Trump in the way in which he tries to discredit anybody who criticises his actions, when actually a decent public servant would have done the honourable thing, would have had a little bit of humility and would have apologised to the British public for what they put them through.
The report has also criticised Mr Johnson's behaviour in recent days. Last week he announced he was resigning, attacking the committee as a kangaroo court.
I swear by Almighty God.
Another serious contempt, the committee says, which would have significantly increased their recommended suspension to 90 days. In a statement, Mr Johnson said the findings were rubbish and a lie, and said in order to reach this deranged conclusion, the committee had been obliged to say a series of things that were patently absurd, and that it was a dreadful day for MPs and democracy. He does have some supporters who share his view.
I think it's spiteful, vindictive and overreaching, quite frankly. This is a completely unfair report. As Boris Johnson says, this feels very much like a stitch-up. In terms of due process, we'll all do that. I don't think he has been treated fairly at all. And saying he's deliberately misled the House, I mean, how can they possibly come to that conclusion? Where is the evidence for this? I've not seen any. So I'm going to be speaking against this, I'm going to be voting against this, and I hope other colleagues do so as well.
Call a general election.
In the Commons, the Leader of the House said that vote would happen on Monday.
It will be a painful process and a sad process for all of us, the task that we face on Monday. But all of us must do what we think is right, and others must leave us alone to do so.
The Prime Minister was out on an immigration raid in London early this morning. Number 10 say they don't know if he's read the report yet. He certainly hadn't when he spoke to journalists in an interview scheduled for before it was published.
You're talking about a report that I haven't seen and no one else has seen. It wouldn't be right to comment on it in advance of it coming out and being published.
This time last year, Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister.
Is this the end, Mr Johnson?
This morning, now not even an MP, he was out for a run. He has said he wanted to come back to Parliament. This report's wholesale savaging of his conduct towards it is likely to make that significantly harder. Helen Catt, BBC News, Westminster.
And so, Nick, what happens now?
There will be a debate and vote on this report on Monday. Jane, it's highly likely to pass through the Commons, but I do think there is a bit unease on the Conservative benches. We have a list of at least 9 Conservative MPs who've criticised the findings so far, and chatting to Boris Johnson's allies, they think the suggestion of a 90-day suspension was vindictive, and they are trying to persuade more MPs of that case. However, we shouldn't lose track of the main story this afternoon, which is that a committee of his peers has found that Boris Johnson misled Parliament, that he did so deliberately, that he should have known a lot more about what was going on in Downing Street, and it's just not believable that he didn't realise the rules had been broken when he told Parliament and by extension the public that has happened. It's a damning report. It's going to be extremely difficult reading for Mr. Johnson, and it raises the question of if there is any prospect of a political comeback. Mr. Johnson in the past has been the sort of political operator who could almost defy political gravity. He simply got away with with things that other politicians just wouldn't. But this might be just a step too far, even for him.
Nick, thank you. Nick Eardley at Westminster.